Hi everybody, David here from VIA Render. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. If you're watching this video, it's possible that you're already a Twinmotion user and you're thinking about switching to D5. And if that's the case, I want to look at a number of differences that you need to be aware of between Twinmotion and D5. And hopefully this will help you if you decide to introduce D5 into your current workflow. Okay, with that being said, let's go ahead and get into it. So, the very first things that we want to talk about in relation to moving from Twinmotion to D5 actually do with the interface and navigation. So here we are with a pretty basic scene set up in SketchUp. You can see we've got a pretty simple arrangement and we've got a plane on the outside which will act as an emissive light. Okay, the question then is how to get this over to D5. If you've been using Twinmotion for any length of time, you're probably used to using the Twinmotion datasmith. You can see that right here on my screen. It's pretty simple to export a datasmith file, and once you're in Twinmotion, you can go ahead and just load that in. Now, D5 is going to be a little bit different. Instead of a datasmith, there is the D5 converter. Now, this is available from the D5 website. You can download it and install it as an extension directly into SketchUp. Once you do that, this will appear in your toolbar, and to get your content over from SketchUp to D5, all you've got to do is go ahead and click this Connect to D5 Render. Now, you can see here in the newer versions of the datasmith, there is direct link autosync. This generally means that changes you make to your Twinmotion scene will be updated immediately. It's very similar to the Lumion live link. The D5 converter still has a manual button, which means that once the link has been made and you make any changes to your scene, for example, if we were to go ahead and just lift up this little thing, you can see that it won't be reflected immediately within D5. So you do have to get in the habit of just clicking this little button right here, but the transfer of data is incredibly fast. Okay, with that being said, let's bounce over to look at one difference that I think might affect some of your workflow a little bit. Something else that you might want to be mindful of pertains to the ground plane right here. By default, if you've been using Twinmotion any length of time, you'll be familiar with the idea of coming into your scene and finding a ground plane, and it usually looks like this. Now, this is adjustable, obviously. From the right, it's referred to as the starting ground. You can lift it up and move it around, and it can be really useful because you can apply different textures directly to this. For example, if you wanted to have a grass texture, you could go ahead and apply that. Now, D5 does not feature a ground plane by default. So what this means is, in SketchUp, we have to be mindful of our scenes and we have to go ahead and create a ground plane. Now, many of you will probably do this by default anyway, depending on the software that you're using to send information over to D5. It's just a little thing and it's worth being mindful of. So far, I haven't found it to be a huge barrier to doing work, and if you've used SketchUp's landscape tools, or you're bringing in any sort of other data, whether it's 3D data, then it really doesn't make a huge bit of difference. But it is just something to be mindful of. The only other time that I found it to be a little bit problematic is sometimes placing assets in D5. You may actually find that without the presence of a ground plane, they may pop a little bit lower or higher in your scene, and you may need to manually adjust them. But so far, it hasn't really been a big issue, and I don't think that you'll find it a big issue either. Once you're in Twinmotion, you're probably used to using the WASD keys, along with the Q and E keys to lift up your camera. The right mouse button will allow you to spin around, and the middle mouse button will allow you to scroll in and out. Navigation in D5 is similar, but just a little bit different. By default, when you get over to D5, you'll find that the right mouse button is actually used to spin around your assets, and the middle mouse button will allow you to zoom in and out. Now, I'm not a huge fan of this, and I much prefer the WASD form of navigation. And to go ahead and do that, all we've got to do is go up to this little icon on the right and switch to fly. All right, once we do that, we can use the WASD keys and the Q and E keys to navigate up and down. This is similar to Lumion and Twinmotion, and I find it a much more easy way to navigate your scene. By default, unlike using the number keys 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 for Twinmotion to speed up or slow down your camera, you're actually going to use this little icon up here. So I found that somewhere between 5 and really around 13 is pretty fine for navigating quite smoothly around your scene. But you can go ahead and crank this really high, and you can see just how quickly you can move in and around your scene. Now this is really useful if you're working on very, very large scenes. In addition, you can also press the shift button to speed up your navigation, just if you're in a scene and you want to pull the camera back really quickly or get a better bird's eye view. All in all, it's a pretty easy setting to change, and you'll find D5 to be incredibly responsive, separate to whatever level of viewport rendering you have. One thing to note about D5 as well, as you bounce over from Twinmotion, bringing your assets over from whatever rendering or whatever modeling software you're using, is the display. Now, a lot of times in Twinmotion, people will work really with the medium settings, maybe the high. Now, depending on your monitor and depending on what scene you're working in, you may be able to use the ultra presets. I, however, spent most of my time working on the medium and high. I have found that when it comes to D5 and the viewport performance, you can spend a lot more time in the high quality and worry less about the middle and low. That's not to say that you can't at any point drop these down. You really can. You can go from the high quality preview to the middle and to the low pretty quickly. And there's also keyboard shortcuts for that as well. However, I found performance on D5 to be a lot better at handling higher levels of geometry. I am aware that mileage may vary a little bit on that, but for the most part, it's been pretty good at handling scenes up to 30 or 40 million faces. It's been pretty good so far. If you've been using Twinmotion for any length of time, you're pretty comfortable with the interface. And one thing about that is going to be the use of nested menus. So, for example, if I wanted to go ahead and add a wood material here, I'll go to Materials, and then I'll click on, let's go down to our Wood Materials, which is going to be actually right at the top, Wood Materials here. And then I can go ahead and just drag this out onto my object. And then if I want to adjust the color, I can go here and then click More, and so forth and so on. Now, I will say, this took me a long time to get the hang of in Twinmotion, and I think it's a little bit outdated. I think the interface requires a little bit of updating, especially the arrangement of really menus within menus. Now, if we bounce over to D5 and we go ahead and hit M on the keyboard and I go Material and I look for Wood, you can find them really quickly over here, and I can just go ahead and drag those out onto my actual asset. Any of the content relating to that material is actually going to appear right over here on the right hand side. And so I think this is a little bit more accessible. Now, D5's materials are just one part of it. In terms of the actual menu complexity though, it's a pretty straightforward interface. We've got scenes or camera settings over here, layers, objects, and then really just the environment and material tabs right here. That's pretty much it. It's a much cleaner, and I would suggest a little bit more modern of an interface. In fact, the complexity that you get in Twinmotion is in many ways still available in D5. It's just that the user interface might be considered a little bit more easy to pick up. All right, let's go ahead and move on. The second difference between Twinmotion and D5 really has to do with Quixel Megascans. So at this point, you're probably aware that Epic basically Epic game developers of Fortnite did go ahead and buy Quixel Megascans as a separate entity, and they also bought Twinmotion. Now this happened a number of years ago, and over time there's been a greater push to really integrate the two. In other words, to form a cohesive ecosystem for rendering and visualization. Now, what that means in practical terms, if you're a Twinmotion user who's used Twinmotion over the last 2 years, you're already aware that the Megascans library is entirely accessible from within Twinmotion, which is unbelievably impressive, both from a architecture point of view, a programming point of view, an integration and workflow point of view. It's an incredibly awesome achievement, and it makes things really, really easy. So for example, if we were in a situation where you wanted to apply a specific material to a specific object, it's really, really easy just to go ahead, go to the Megascans, go to surfaces, look for something that you want. Maybe you're looking for something with a bit of more dramatic rock. Go ahead and find a jagged one. And it's so easy just to download this. And you can see it should load pretty quickly. And you can just drag it on to your object. Now, that is, in my mind, just an unbelievably cool thing. When working in D5, however, your options are going to be less streamlined. You can load any surface that you download from the Megascan library and actually load it up as a PBR material. So for example, you can load up your base color map, and I'm going to just use my eyedropper here to sample this wood material, which is downloaded from the Megascans library. Looking at that floor right there, you can see I've got the base color map loaded here on the right, and then I've got my normal map, my roughness map, my AO, and height or displacement map as well. The difference here is that there isn't an automatic process that will do it for you, akin to what we just saw in Twinmotion. It is more manual. It doesn't take as long as you think, and as long as you've got your paths, in other words, where your Quixel Megascans objects or surfaces download to, as long as that's set up in an efficient manner, you can actually go ahead and load these in pretty quickly, but it is definitely not as easy. Now, in saying that, you can also go ahead and download objects too, and the workflow is pretty similar. You can go up here to the top left and import, and you can just download your basically your Megascan objects or 3D objects. They will take a minute to load up, but once they're loaded into your scene, you can also add them to your asset library here. For example, under local, I've got a whole bunch of different assets that I've saved. It's not as streamlined as it is within Twinmotion, and that's just something that you'll kind of have to get used to. But I will say, it's also no different than how Twinmotion used to be if you were bringing in external assets. And this will be very familiar to anyone who's been really using these sort of real-time rendering engines for the last few years, whether it's Lumion or Twinmotion. In many ways, even if you're using a SketchUp V-Ray or SketchUp Onscape model, then you still have to get comfortable with bringing models and materials in. So just something to be mindful of. But in saying that, D5's ability to load up and utilize assets is really, really good. But it is just not as accessible. The next thing we want to talk about is assets. Now, we've already talked about the Megascans library, and that's totally fine. But separate to that, let's just talk about the actual assets that you get really to play around with in your scenes. And this is where I think D5 has the advantage. Now, I'm going to ignore the Megascans, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Some of the assets that are in the Megascans are very much game-orientated and really have very limited use. There's some really, really cool stuff here, and I've definitely taken advantage of some of these. But right now, the nature assets, particularly the trees that are available from Epic, if you're using the Unreal Engine, are not necessarily available to us to the same level. You can get, you know, stumps and trunks and things like that, but not the tree models themselves. So separate to that, what do we have? Well, in terms of the object library, it's a mixed bag in Twinmotion. of the home models, for example, things like living rooms and chairs, these have not really stood the test of time. And I always struggled when I used Twinmotion to actually decorate interior scenes. So for example, here we've probably got around 40 interior plants of varying quality. We've got some nice electronic appliances, but it is a limited selection. We've also got things like bedroom assets, beds, and storage, but these also are extremely, extremely limited. And, you know, in my mind, I love Twinmotion, I really do. My first paid professional project was done with Twinmotion, but the assets themselves have gone the way that some of Lumion's assets have, which is that they're kind of old and kind of stale. And I mean that, you know, again, like I said, I do love Twinmotion, and I am aware that they are constantly adding assets. For example, you know, these musical assets are really, really cool, and they're really nice, and they're fun to have in your scene. But considering a lot of architectural visualization and architectural rendering is built around, you know, realistic standard places, you know, most people aren't looking for you to design an entire music room. What you really want is access to modern decorative elements. Now, you could argue that is my opinion, and that is absolutely true. It is very much my opinion. Maybe you get paid to design really cool, you know, musical instrument orientated rooms, and in which case I'm a little off base here, but for the most part we're looking for decorative elements, and that is one thing I think that Twinmotion is a little bit lacking in. Even if we go to the kitchen tab and we look at the food assets, these are really cool, they are really nice, but I'm also looking for a lot more just glassware and things like that. And in that case, yeah, there's some really, really nice stuff here. But there's not as much as you'd want. And, you know, can you decorate an entire scene with this? I don't think so. You've got a lot of glassware here, but none of the decorative elements. And if we go outside of the home here and we just look at, for example, living rooms, and we look at chairs, like, this stuff is okay-ish. You know, you could probably do some really nice kitchen work, but let's take a look at the D5 asset library. And so if we click on this and we go to online and we just look at, for example, furniture, even just sofas alone, there is over 500 of them. And many of them are just staggeringly beautiful models. And there's a huge, huge variety of them. I think in my mind, they're more modern, they're more up to date, they're more in keeping with current interior design trends. And when you look at sort of some of the really fantastic gallery work, oftentimes it's using some of these really amazing assets. Going back to what I originally said about decorative elements in particular, in terms of just ornaments, D5's asset library has just under 700 of these, and they're of a really, really high standard. They're really beautiful, they're really fantastic. The asset library is also entirely online. I'm going to go ahead and put this display back to high resolution, and you can just kind of see, like, these assets, they just look really, really good. If I just go to my favorites tab over here, you can see, just scrolling down, you've got an amazing array of high quality interior decorative elements that are all PBR based, and all the materials are generally editable. In other words, if you find a couch or chair that you like, but you want to change the material on it, you can. Now, I found that really problematic in Twinmotion. It was a lot of questioning whether I can change the material on specific assets or not. In D5, to the best of my knowledge, every asset that I've used, I can change the materials on it. And again, I just think the asset quality is just higher. Now, I know that a lot of you Twinmotion users then are also going to say, well, what about Sketchfab? I can go to Sketchfab and I can click on anything and I can search for anything. And I'm going to get into my own personal preference here right now. Yes, you can. You have access to, I think, pretty much all of the TwinFab stuff, which is like, I think, like tens of thousands of models, and that's awesome. I don't have the time to work my way through these and look for really quality stuff. Now, I'm sure there's probably a way that you can go to Sketchfab, log in, search for asset IDs, find really cool furniture, find really cool stuff, and add it to your scene. But, you know, if you're doing like literally like architectural visualization and you want to show off an interior scene, I really don't know when I'm going to find time to look at these, nor do I know how well these objects are modeled, nor do I know the material setup. There's just a lot of question marks over this to me. And I'm not taking away from any of this stuff. This stuff is really, 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 really cool. And if I was doing like generalist 3D stuff, I would absolutely like, this is just so cool. Like, this is really, really cool. The issue though just comes down to accessibility and speed. And really, I just want to have an asset library that I know I can grab really good stuff from almost immediately and place it right into my scene. And this thing is just really beautiful. That again might come down to personal preference. And if you're coming at this from a different field, then absolutely, like that is so cool. Like, it's just very, very cool. But from an architectural visualization point of view, I just want to know that the elements, the assets that come by default with my program are going to be good enough. And I do think Twinmotion, like Lumion to some degree, has finally kind of caught up and updated a lot of that stuff. But in D5, you've just got an incredible, incredible array of really high quality assets. You can build amazing interior visualizations using just the D5 assets without having to go anywhere else. And I think once you start using them, you'll find it hard to go back looking at older stuff. Hi everybody. If you've made it to this point, you're probably about halfway through the video. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much for supporting the channel. It's great to see the likes and comments from viewers like yourselves who've taken the time to comment on videos. In the second part, I want to get into something which I think will be of importance to everyone, and that's really comparing Twinmotion's ray trace, well, it's path trace engine versus D5's real-time ray tracing engine. And so we're going to look at those briefly, and then we're going to compare and contrast to see which one gives the better result. All right, thank you again so much for watching. Okay, if you're a Twinmotion user over the last year and a half, then you're probably very familiar with the path tracer. So the path tracer is effectively become the de facto rendering within Twinmotion. Now, if you're a Twinmotion user, you're probably used to going in here, clicking the giant render button, adjusting the settings by going basically low, medium, high, or going in there and actually tweaking this really as you go. Now, I will say, as a Twinmotion user and, you know, someone who used Twinmotion, you know, before the path tracer was a component in it, the difference is just staggeringly high. The quality that you get in rendered results in the path tracer versus the default rasterized version of Twinmotion is absolutely staggering. Now, it is not, however, perfect. And there's a couple of issues that I have with the path tracer. I am running this on a, you know, about a 2-year-old handmade, basically, you know, pretty decent machine running a 3070. I still run into issues with the path tracer. In fact, running this, you know, setting this up to even just a medium setting, the time delay between pressing the button and looking at the finished result, it's not huge, but it can get kind of frustrating. In fact, by default, I'll generally work with a path tracer set to below the standard, even the baseline low quality settings as I nip around my scene. And almost exclusively, I won't be able to work with this on. I don't know anyone who probably can. In fact, it's going to stay off pretty much almost all the time until I get to the point where I start looking at my render settings. Now, many of you are probably going to say, well, that's kind of what you do. But it would be nice if the performance of this was substantially better. I still like it and I still love the end results, but it is kind of nice if we go over really quickly to D5 and take a look at that. We'll actually see how this performs. If we look over here in D5, what you see is what you get. In other words, there is no giant path tracing button that you actually have to press. D5 is running on, effectively, it's a ray traced engine. It's a very heavily altered version of the Unreal Engine 4 with some new bells and whistles, including global illumination and effectively real-time sort of ray bounces. That's my amateur understanding of the programming behind it, but it is definitely a case of what you see is what you get. So for example, this is the exact same scene that we had in Twinmotion. I've got the exact same emissive light on the outside, and I don't actually have to worry about how this is going to look when I hit the render button, because quite simply how it looks in your viewport is exactly how it is going to look. All of the settings that you can see over here on the right, whether I'm lighting my scene with the geo and sky, so that's just kind of ambient pseudo sun, or whether I'm using a HDRI, that is basically happening in real time. There's a little bit of delay. You can kind of see the kind of blurring effect that takes place, but for the most part, I'm running this in high mode on a base 3070, and I'm seeing how my scene is looking. There are things I can change here. For example, I can add an additional sun, and I can go in and affect things like the overall exposure level, and I can affect some other parameters like the highlight, shadow, and slope, and things like that. But if I was to go ahead and just add, for example, just lights into my scene here, I don't have to worry about wondering how this is actually going to look in a finished render mode. I can actually just see how those lights are actually working right now as it currently stands. I can tell exactly where the fall off is and the strength of these. And so you can kind of see there is a lot of benefit to be had from this approach. You might ask, or at least maybe say, is this as physically accurate as the path tracing engine? And honestly, I can't answer that. I have a very low knowledge of the programming and engineering behind these programs. But one thing I have noticed is sharpness and the fidelity. Users of Twinmotion will probably be aware that you can go in and adjust the landscape within Twinmotion. So for example, you can go up here to the landscape tab and drag in terrain. Once you've done this, you can go ahead and sculpt the terrain, making hills or valleys, or really just building a site for whatever exterior render that you're doing. As it currently stands, D5 does not have landscape options. You are obliged to bring in a landscape plane from your modeling software. So in this case, you would bring in a plane from SketchUp instead. And even if you do, you don't have the ability to modify that plane. When it comes to grass, however, the two programs are a little bit different. Twinmotion users will be used to grabbing grass and manually placing it by hand, or going ahead and using the ability to basically drop in grass on your plane using the vegetation paint options. So you can do this with grass here, and you can go ahead and drag this on and then start painting it into your environment. And longtime users will be pretty familiar and comfortable with that. In D5, grass is handled a little bit differently. So for example, if we go ahead and go to our materials tab, hitting I on our keyboard, we can actually change the default green area here to a grass material. Now, I'm going to go ahead and apply that, and there we go. So when you do that, you have options on the right to adjust the height and to adjust the density and the trim. If you want, you can also go ahead and manually place grass models. So for example, if we go over here on the left and we go to nature, we'll have the ability to place either ornamental grass or shrubs or flowering shrubs in our scene. And you can get a very nice result just really by mixing and matching these different material types, using the procedural grass texture mixed with some hand sprinkled grass assets. When it comes to lights, if you're a Twinmotion user, you're probably familiar with a certain lighting setup. For example, you're used to perhaps using Omni lights to light up or give additional light in your scene. D5 also comes with a number of lights. These will be very familiar if you've used any sort of rendering program before. We have a point light, which is very similar to an Omni light insofar that it launches its light outwards in a 360-degree arc. Just like in Twinmotion, you can adjust the intensity, and you can also adjust the fall off or attenuation radius. You also have options for changing the color or the temperature, so you can make your lights warmer or colder. And again, because D5 is a real-time ray tracing render engine, you're effectively seeing lights, how they look in real time, without having to see how they look in a path tracer enabled mode. We also have spotlights, which again, the strength will be very comparable. We can go ahead and just place them in our scene. We can adjust the intensity, the cone angle, and the attenuation radius, effectively the fall off cone. Now, one thing that is different from Twinmotion is that you can see here, when it comes to spotlights, there are a lot more IES light profiles available to Twinmotion users. D5 does come with a number of default IES light profiles, and you can always go ahead and customize or load up your own if you have access to the IES light profile. In addition, Twinmotion users will be familiar with emissive or neon lights. I'm going to go ahead and place these in our scene, and I can actually just deactivate the other lights here. And in a similar fashion, D5 also gives access to these lights. Now, if you're doing interior design, you're probably used to using something similar to this or something similar to the area lights to light up your scene. In D5, we can also use strip lights. These will work in a similar fashion. So for example, I can delete that. And these are great for under cabinet lighting or for lighting in kitchen or bathroom scenes. The last light type that you'll probably be familiar with from Twinmotion is going to be the area lights. These are really useful for adding light into a room, perhaps coming in through the windows, or for just brightening up the overall scene if you place it on the ceiling. Now we can do the same again in D5. A rectangular light will work in a similar fashion. We can just lift it up, so select it, lift it up, and then over here on the right, we can adjust the size. And that way, we can go ahead and light up entire areas using a very familiar lighting system. And again, because it is in real time, what you see is what you get. So as I dim the intensity here, you can see that is going to be reflected in your viewport almost immediately. So as such, the lighting setup in D5 will be really familiar to anyone coming over from Twinmotion. And so here we have the final image. So this is the image from Twinmotion, and we use the path tracer with the number of rays per bounce at about 750, and I think each one was set to bounce around 30 times. And I'm genuinely really happy with the result. There are some problems. You can see the material on this map back here is probably a little too strong and a little bit too shiny. But overall, the sort of interplay of light and shadows and the materials, I really, really do like this. Especially this object right here. I think this looks fantastic. And the cup and the wood material are particularly nice. Now, the alternative is the D5 version. It's genuinely a lot whiter in terms of light, and again, I tried to match up the light as best I could. Again, this material from Quixel looks really, really nice, and the table material looks really, really good. I was able to tweak the material settings for the painting in the background. That's probably just due to having a little bit more time to set this one up than to set up the Twinmotion render. But all in all, I think I like both of these a lot, and I think both of them are up to the standard for really the current standard of architectural visualization. So really, it just depends on which one you want to work with a little bit more. In saying that, the last thing I want to talk about in terms of jumping from Twinmotion to D5 is stability. Now, on this one, D5 wins out for me. Twinmotion is just substantially more unstable, and I know there's a lot of different sort of issues there, but for the most part, I've had almost no crashes with D5 in really the last year of using it, maybe a little bit longer than that. And in the time I've used Twinmotion, almost every time I use Twinmotion, I do seem to run into some issue, whether I'm using a patched version or whether I'm using the latest, shiniest release. Stability remains a big issue. Okay, hopefully this video has helped you out, and if you've enjoyed it, please think about subscribing. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.